For those of you who may be new to Pathstone, here is a bit of background on our firm. We are an independent, privately owned, registered investment advisor. We provide comprehensive, highly customized wealth management advice and services to families, family offices, foundations, and endowments. I will now hand it over to our Chief Impact Officer, Erika Karp. Erika, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Erika. And good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this call. I personally, as the Chief Impact Officer here, think that water, and I apologize for how I say that word, I'm from Brooklyn, but water, I think, is one of the most critical and intersectional issues that we've got in the world. Because I think we all know that the last drop of water has a value that's greater than pretty much anything else. So David and Will, if you would come onto the screen, I will tell you, everyone who's listening, we probably have more expertise on the issue of water on this call than you can imagine. And so again, the two of you, I thank you so much for bringing us the corporate perspective and the investment perspective all at the same time. In terms of getting started, I would like to start with the science and the technology and the fact that some people would argue that there is no water scarcity problem. The earth is covered with water, miles of water, so there's no water scarcity issue. When you think about that, could you tell me what your first impression is? Will, you know what? I'm going to apologize for a minute. And I see your smile. Before we go there, Will, could you tell us, and David, then I'm going to you, could you tell us what in your professional life, what do you think about the most and what do you worry about the most? And David, I'll go to the same to you and then we'll go to the high level question.
So Erika, you've known me a long time. You know I'm an optimist. So, I approach this from we can fix what's broken in the world of water, and everything's broken in my opinion. So, what do I think about? What do I focus on? Really challenging the status quo. I mean, our biggest problem is the status quo, the inability to adapt quickly to the impacts of climate change and poor management, poor public policy, aging, underfunded infrastructure, and so on. And a related issue is I really do push on action. So, and David knows this, that, my conversations are usually, well, what can we do? What can we do now? As opposed to, assuming that this is a slow walking crisis that we'll have to deal with in 10 or 20 years. So, those are the two things that are top of mind for me in terms of how I spend my time on, both the consulting side and the investing side.
Thank you. David, what do you think about? What do you worry about most?
Yeah, I think for me, it's the 286 PepsiCo operations and another 800 odd co-manufacturers that manufacture on our behalf. We're entering pretty uncharted territory when it comes to water stress now. And we've got a reasonably high profile when it comes to operations located in water stress sites. So for me, that's kind of the key worry in terms of how that exposure is growing, and it is. And then secondly, I would count PepsiCo as one of those companies that is fairly progressive when it comes to taking action on water. There are hundreds of other companies that are doing very little. And PepsiCo can't act alone. This is a collaborative effort, and it's a constant thought process in terms of how do we get others on the same bandwidth of us and moving in the same direction of us, because unless that happens, we'll never solve the problem.
So back to that issue, the problem. There's so much water on this planet. Why do we have a crisis if you think we do?
David, should I jump into this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we're fortunate that we live, on the blue planet. There is water to sustain life. We have a management problem, though. and water is always a local issue. It's not always when it's not always where you need it, of the right quality. And again, I want to keep coming back to climate change, that has shuffled the deck in terms of, what has been a hydrologic cycle that, I would say we understood fairly well at a local level, and now changed that rather dramatically. So yeah, we have a lot of water on Earth, but we have used it poorly, we have polluted it, and not managed it terribly well.
Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I mean, we have got a lot of water, yes. If you actually look at, and I was trying to rack my brains, but I can't recall now, the actual amount of that water that is fresh water is a tiny fraction of the amount of water that's available. Most of it's salt water. Of the amount that's fresh water, most of that's in polar ice caps, and there's quite a bit underground in groundwater aquifers, and actual fresh water that flows on the surface that we see, that's probably like 0.3%. So a lot of water, but not much available to us from a freshwater point of view, and it's often located in areas that we aren't. So we typically like building cities in water stressed areas for some reason, close to coasts, in deserts, and in very water stressed areas. Populations grow there, but the water is not necessarily where the population is. So that also exacerbates the water stress over and above climate change and all the other issues that Will's just mentioned now.
Mm-hmm. With what you just said, we can kind of go anywhere. Like, for instance, why do you build plants in water stressed areas? And do you compensate your executives for not doing that, or for being really efficient with that? I don't want to go there yet, because I want to stay a little high level. And Will, we're going to go to desalinization and every other technology, but staying high level, it has been said that some of the geopolitical crises we see are water crises, and caused this way. What are your thoughts on that issue, either of you?
I'd say without a doubt. I mean, water, the sort of often mentioned narrative around water is that it's a conflict issue. It's for fighting. The infamous Mark Twain quote about water in the American West and so on. So, yeah, I mean, it's a geopolitical issue. It's a national security issue. I think Singapore is a really good example of, a country that viewed water as a strategic resource and adjusted accordingly in terms of enacting public policies that value water and also focus very much on technology solutions to the point where they have a robust technology export business. I personally agree. I think that water is also an opportunity to bring people together. Water, everyone needs water. It can be a way to build relationships between stakeholders and countries and regions that otherwise might not cooperate. So again, I'm an optimist. I think there are some good examples of, cross-boundary agreements that, are glued together because of the common value of water.
Could you be more specific? Give us some of those examples.
Yeah, certainly in the U.S., water is, really not managed at the federal level. It's managed at the state level. So you have watersheds like the Delaware River Basin Commission. You have the Colorado River Compact, which, that is broken, but nevertheless, it does bind states together to manage water, as cooperatively as they can, considering very different interests and stakeholder groups. I think the Middle East is a good example. There are water agreements in the Middle East, and in a part of the world that doesn't agree on a whole lot, having water agreements between countries that are in incredibly water scarce regions, for me is something that, is a good example. We could do better, and I think that's a positive piece of the puzzle.
So, by the way, just give me an inning. If you had to say, what inning are we in with regard to, creating, a real a global regime on water? Where are we?
I don't think we've left the dugout. Quite candidly, I think we have an incredibly long way to go. And I'll cite the U.S. I mean, we don't have a national water strategy at all. We have no shortage of regulations. We have state regulations, we have federal regulations, state regulations, local regulations, but we don't acknowledge that water has strategic value for the country, and just multiply that. There are certainly countries that take an opposing point of view and view it strategically, and build public policy and technology platforms and so on. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of really viewing it as something that we should cooperate on and support each other, so we have abundance of water. And David, you're sort of nodding, so.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading an article the other day looking at, funny enough, the subject about water conflicts, and they almost backdated to the Babylonian times. There's been about 925 conflicts around water since then, right? And it's increasing. And there's also major ones brewing at the moment. You got the Renaissance Dam, which is the Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So Ethiopia wants to build that massive dam on the Nile for hydroelectricity. That's going to impact Egypt down the line as well. You got a similar thing playing out in the Brahmaputra River Basin, which is India, China, and Bangladesh. And another one happening in the Euphrates Basin. And it's all, one country deciding they're going to build a dam or divert water that then disadvantages countries further down the line. And those tensions are still very much brewing there. And it's interesting as well that some more subtle ones, I was reading an article the other day about the fact that in Arizona, there are some foreign countries, Saudi, I think it was, that own or rent a large tracts of land to grow alfalfa to send to Saudi to feed their dairy cattle there. And that's causing tension now, because essentially what you're doing is you're taking water out of the US and shipping it over to Saudi because they don't have enough water. And while it's not a country by country conflict, it's certainly creating that sort of conflict within the US, and farmers saying, well, what's going on? This is not fair that you're taking our water out of it, and now we're disadvantaged. So there's really interesting inter-country conflict, there's in-country conflict. And another great example, in Mexico at the moment, they got massive water shortages. And here you got cartels that are starting to try to take over water sources so they can get skin in the game. They see that as a lucrative way of earning money. So water's got this really interesting role with conflict, where it's looking at from a cartel point of view, in-country conflict or intra-country conflict as well. So certainly not going anywhere.
So David, am I going to piss you off right now?
Erika, you're off brand.
Sorry, my reception's get a bit bad here. Sorry. I might just drop off.
That was very rude. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's talk about corporate water stewardship. And as an investor, why do I care?
Why do you care? You care because a company that's not managing its water resources has a massive risk on its hands, right? And you just have to see what's going on in the West, what's happened recently in Western Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of LATAM. Water scarcity is here, right? And it's a matter of time that it starts impacting companies. And you need to know what your exposure is to these companies that have a high reliance on water, such as the food and beverage industry, and even industries like IT. Microsoft, funny enough, has got a very high exposure to water sheds because they need so much water for cooling. So from an investor point of view, you care because your portfolio is potentially at risk. If a company is unable to get the amount of water they need to produce, they cut production, and that impacts their revenue streams, and that obviously has that knock-on effect in terms of your investment case. So at a very high level, that's why you care.
Mm-hmm. And Will, when we go to, as an investor, again, I care a lot about the material financial risk of water and water scarcity and water stewardship. When you go into a corporation, you have been, consulting on this for decades. What is it that you are trying to really bring out? And then, David, we're going to ask you to tell us about Pepsi. So go ahead.
Yeah, the starting point is understanding a company's business strategy and the role that water plays in that strategy. You can't grow your business, in particular, any food and beverage company or even apparel company, unless you quantify business value at risk from water and intervene to ensure you have business continuity and you can support business growth. So it's that high level. What's your business strategy? Do you have a growth strategy? If so, what parts of the world? And how do you bring in the narrative to David's point about water as a business risk? The business value at risk piece is really important. It's more than just looking at a map and saying, oh, gee, I have a bottling plant in an area that is water scarce and water stressed. It's actually converting that to business value, which I would say at the very least is, how much revenue am I generating from this bottling plant? How much might I generate going forward? What's the risk from business disruption, from physical risk, regulatory risk, and reputational risk? And using that as a basis to make investments in mitigating the risk, from a quantity and a quality perspective. So that's typically the starting point. It's really getting companies to think about water, the value of water beyond the price, which is essentially free.
Mm-hmm. So David, what is the stewardship plan at PepsiCo?
Yeah, so I mean, very much what Will was saying now. We take quite a comprehensive view of water. We look at it from both a demand and supply point of view. So demand, specifically looking at how we manage water within our facilities, so driving down water use. And then also from a supply point of view, is that says, we can be the most efficient company in the world, but if the water's not arriving in our factory in the first place, it doesn't help anything, does it? So we've got quite a strong focus in terms of what we do from a watershed point of view. So where we're operating in water stressed areas, what programmatic activity do we have to implement along with different partners to reduce that water stress? How do we rehabilitate degraded watersheds? How do we promote water security in those watersheds? And the approach that we've taken is very much like Will outlined. We've got a extremely good view of knowing exactly where all our facilities are, what their current water risk exposure is, what their projected water risk exposure is, what production volume comes out of that, and being able to then flex our growth plans around that, and also again making sure we are as efficient as possible. And that can serve as a competitive advantage for us. When areas that are very water stressed, if we've got a very low water footprint, we are able to continue operating. And a great example of that, Mexico is extremely water stressed at the moment. One of our biggest food facility in the PepsiCo group, and I think it's probably one of the biggest food facilities in the world, is located there. That facility has now gone 5 months without using a drop of fresh water. And that gives us an advantage there, because other food companies that may require fresh water, they're going to have a lot of stress in terms of their continuing operation. But we are able to do that without any fresh water. So that's a kind of a great example of where we can have both reduce the risk to the business, but also create a competitive advantage for our business at the same time.
How did you do that?
So it's a combination of two things. So the firstly, and this really talks to the circularity of water as well, which is a really important subject, which we may get back onto a bit later. So firstly, we recover and recycle a lot of water within that facility. So when it gets different parts of the process, we'll take the water out, clean it back to potable water standards, and bring it back into the process. What we also do is we take the processed water from other food companies that they don't use, and we use that. So we almost carrying on the life of that water. So instead of that water then getting discharged into the public sewer, we take that water, clean it up, and reuse it within our facilities.
That's cool. Will, can we invest in that? If you want
yes.
we need to do that.
Yeah, there are technologies that fit into the circular strategy that David and the company have developed. You wanted to go back to a comment that you made very early, Erika, around, well, why would you build anything in a water scarce or water stressed area? And I had a conversation a number of years ago with one of David's competitors, and he said that, and he managed, sustainability and water stewardship, overall. And he said, our goal is not to exit water scarce and water stressed markets. It's to learn how to operate in those marketplaces because they have customers there. So, David's example, I think, is really good. A good example of that thinking that, well, we can't move away from these locations that are water scarce and water stressed and have other water related challenges, because there's certainly a market there. There's a workforce there. There is, assets that you've built in those locations. So the goal is to really do more with less water, or do without, quite candidly. And you and I have talked about this, that scarcity drives innovation. Like smart people at smart companies figure things out, and when they figure it out, that creates all sorts of opportunities, again, for entrepreneurs, for investors, for multinationals, NGOs, a host of other stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a terrific point there. That the innovation point. So just to kind of loop back slightly with PepsiCo's water goals, specifically our water use efficiency goals for our high water risk operations, they got a separate set of goals, are incredibly aggressive. And we constantly trying to figure out how we're going to get to them. And this breeds innovation. So this example of Mexico was our local engineers there trying to figure this one out. And they came up with a solution which we are now trying to replicate in other businesses. But it's also, there's this hunger within the business to try to figure this out. And we've got R&D teams working on this, and we got our PepsiCo labs, which brings in external startups to see how they can support us in terms of figuring out our problems. And you get this really great community evolving, trying to solve water, helping us, but then that technology then helps others as well. And a great example with Will is the Colorado River Basin Fund. So that's something that PepsiCo invested in for this exact purpose, to say, how do we get these great tech startups who will not only help us, but help others, because we need others, as I mentioned earlier, to come on this journey with us. And if you can get that technology at a better price point that people can actually realistically implement, all the better.
So in terms of the technology that enables this kind of circular economy, David, are there certain areas, regions? I mean, I would think like Israel is an interesting place to get that kind of innovative opportunity. Are there certain regions where you find yourselves, spending more for the opportunities?
Yeah, not really. It's pretty widespread, actually. So Israel, certainly, they got some really interesting technology. We've actually partnering with an Israeli firm on irrigation for our agriculture. This is called NDRIP, where they're using essentially a powerless irrigation system. So generally with drip irrigation, you need pumps, etc., to run these things. This runs on solar. So you can take a really efficient irrigation system and put it anywhere in the world where you get sunlight. But we got great innovation coming out of LATAM. We've got great innovation coming out of Europe, the US. So I'll pretty say it's pretty widespread as opposed to confined to one particular territory.
Cool. You mentioned Colorado River Basin. Will, could you tell us just a little bit about the fund, what you're doing, and the intention of it?
Sure. It sort of goes back to your earlier part of the conversation. Water is always a local issue. And we, so I sit in Denver, headwater state, and we decided that we would mobilize investors and entrepreneurs to focus on a watershed. And the Colorado River Basin is roughly 12% of the US GDP. And that has a very significant economic development impact, and business impact, and ecosystem impact when you're seeing surface water decline dramatically due to impacts of climate change. And yeah, it was really a way to sharpen the mind and get the word out that, watersheds are in threat, and we're going to focus on not just two stakeholder groups, investors and entrepreneurs, but also bringing in, multinationals, Pepsi, and also NGOs that are very active in the watershed, and others, academic institutions that have tech transfer offices and so on. So it was really a way to, essentially create a catalytic community around a place that people value, whether they know it or not, and one that's really under significant threat.
That's perfect. Thank you for that. So, gentlemen, let's talk about kind of the intersectionality issues. Water with tech, you mentioned Microsoft, Intel, water obviously with energy, water with, pretty much we name it, the food systems, obviously. But David, PepsiCo has this beautiful heritage of diversity and inclusion for decades long, which obviously is, many of us think, an economic imperative. So could you talk about, if you can, a little bit about that intersection between water and women's economic empowerment? So this would be SDG 6 and SDG 5. So if you're comfortable talking about that, would be great. And Will, again, if you have any thoughts on this, that would be great. So David, thoughts?
Yes, I think probably the best example there is a partnership that we got with USAID, where we're looking at women empowerment in agriculture. And, again, water plays this absolutely crucial part in agriculture. And, the extent that we were able to support the livelihoods of women in agriculture through optimizing their ability to harness water and use it efficiently, that helps them in terms of growing their livelihoods, their economic, or lessen the economic dependency on others. So that's I'll probably point that as a good example of that intersection between women, food, and water. That intersection sits quite nicely over there.
And making investments that are thoughtful as a company on this issue, there's always trade-offs, right? So you can either make these kinds of investments or do something else. Capital is finite. So what other trade-offs, what trade-offs can you think of that PepsiCo is making for the long term in sustainability versus doing something that's different in the short term? When you think of trade-offs?
That's an interesting one. I think one of the things that we constantly grappling with, and particularly when we look at water use efficiency, for example, is the current technology around water use efficiency is relatively energy intensive, right? So, on one hand, you're reducing water efficiency, on the other hand, you're pushing up your carbon footprint. So that's kind of one of these really interesting dynamics that we're playing with at the moment. And the way we're trying to deal with that is trying to think about the renewable energy component then, in terms of how do we then integrate renewable energies into these decisions that we're making around our future trajectory around water. So probably that water, energy, climate dynamic is extremely up front and center for us as we kind of move down this journey, and unlikely to go away anytime soon, but certainly that's one thing we kind of really trying to figure out as we go forward, because in order for us to hit our 2030 goals, we start investing now in this technology. And again, this technology is not necessarily energy efficient, or has a relatively high energy footprint. So again, that short-term trade-off in terms of an energy hit, but we need to figure out how we solve that long-term and from a renewable energy point of view.
Thank you for that. Will, you're the, go ahead.
No, just to jump in, I mean, that goes back to the NDRIP investment, and that, drip irrigation technology, great, smart precision ag irrigation. However, it has an energy profile and it has a carbon profile. So if you can look at deploying gravity drip irrigation technologies, then you've certainly addressed the water issue. Now you've addressed the energy issue and also the carbon footprint associated with it. And ag is a really interesting space. I mean, you need, water and energy to make food. And, how do you come up with technologies that sort of sit in the middle of that nexus and deliver value across a number of key attributes that are important right now? And of course, we have crop productivity, nutrient additions, and so on. So I just wanted to go back to the technology piece of the puzzle here, that there are technologies like that are they check all the boxes.
Let's stay there. So talk
Okay.
more about the technologies and the investment potential.
Yeah, so now is an exciting time in the world of water. Water got tacked onto the whole clean tech investment boom a while ago. And I would say that didn't play out so well. I think, a number of people were disappointed that, water, had its own unique challenges. But what we bumped into now is that harsh reality that, yes, in fact, we have scarcity. And our traditional sources of water, such as the Colorado River Basin, are not delivering the volumes of water that are needed under status quo. Basically traditional ag or traditional manufacturing, and don't line up well with water allocations and water rights. So now's really the time, because we've definitely hit a speed bump, and I would argue we've hit the wall in terms of not having a gallon of water to do whatever you want to do with it, which is for your home, it's for manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing, agriculture, whatever it may be. And what I focus on is getting to that doing more with less. So driving down the demand side of the equation that aligns with our new reality in terms of how much we have on the supply side. And also thinking about alternative sources of water. One technology we're really interested in is solar desal. The ability to treat water in a cost-effective manner using solar power, as opposed to traditional sources of energy, which again gets back to David's point about how do you balance that value creation around water, but also understand that some technologies have a high energy need and a high carbon footprint. So on the water scarcity side, in quotes, it's reducing demand through technologies, water efficiency, innovative treatment technologies, and water reuse in particular is very attractive across a range of industry sectors.
Mm-hmm. So
I
this
think,
is, sorry, Dave.
No, I was just sort of kind of backing that up in the sense that, to me as well, within the, water is almost infinitely recyclable, right, and reusable. And we tend to take a linear approach to water. When I say we, I'm talking about society as a whole. Kind of you use it, goes to a third-party utility or a city wastewater treatment plant. It gets treated, discharged, and off it goes down the river. We can create a circular economy very quickly, and I think we need to get our heads around the fact that we need to do this, and we need to do this rapidly, because we can reduce that dependency on fresh water. And we've proven this in a very small scale within one of our operations, but this can happen at a city level as well. So to me, that circularity story really needs to get driven home. Sorry, Will.
No, I'm enthusiastically agreeing with you that, and I actually co-authored a paper with Austin Alexander from Xylem on the topic, and we were being provocative in that we framed it as, to your point, right now, water management, the water sector is extractive. We take it, we make something with it, fresh drinking, potable water, and then we throw it away. And that's lunacy, because to David's point, water is this sort of ultimate renewable resource, and it should be circular because it's circular in nature, and we have intervened in that hydrologic cycle. So, you can build a plant that uses water and uses it over and over again and gets water from other sources that are unconventional. So that's how we need to shift our thinking. And again, going back to the innovation and investment side, that's exciting. And, that's where, as they say, the puck is going. It's not traditional infrastructure. It's really thinking about, well, what are the innovations out there that get us to a place where we can have business growth, economic development.
So you guys, this is a yes/no question. Keep it to that. If we had abundant, cheap, green, clean energy, would there be a water scarcity issue? That's a yes or no. Will?
No.
David?
Yes.
Oh, this is great.
I'm going to sit back and, well, why not? If that helps us get to a circular economy.
Well, because it's not just an energy issue or a carbon issue. It's, humanity gets in the way. And, and I go back to the status quo. Yeah, if we had cheap energy, would that drive an abundance of water? No, because, people are pretty comfortable with the way it is. So, technology doesn't sell itself. Solving one particular aspect of technology, it just doesn't get it done. You still have to sell it to somebody. You have to get them to understand that technology innovation has value to them. So it's the human piece, it's the public policy piece that, I would argue in many cases leads to unintended consequences. So it'd be great if we had free renewable energy, and that would open up possibilities, but we still have other aspects that challenge that. And David, feel free to disagree.
No, I agree. I mean, I think the human element is probably the most fascinating out of this, because, if we just look at it cleanly, we have the technologies to do this right now. There's nothing stopping circular water, for example, but it's just not happening. One of the interesting bits that that I've been looking at is, particularly on the beverage side, where they're looking at the beer companies or soft drink companies, none of us would use recycled water in our product, right? And that's because of the yuck factor. If a consumer knows that they're going to be drinking recycled water in their product, would you want to really drink it if you knew that your drinking water came from a sewage plant that the water had been cleaned clearly before it got to you? There's this kind of instant, I wouldn't want to touch it. And, I think we're getting to the point now where that's a luxury. You can't afford to have that reaction anymore, because, and then they, you look at Singapore, they got their new water, which is essentially, recovered water from effluent. Namibia is another great example of a country that's relying quite extensively on recycled and recovered water. But there's this human reaction, because we've had this legacy and luxury of having fresh water, that's kind of built into us, so that's normal. And I think we need that kind of almost a paradigm shift to say that's not normal anymore. It's it is a luxury to have that nowadays in many places, and we have to start thinking about what does a different water supply system look like.
In terms of the yuck factor, I've heard the term toilet to tap, and that really is, extremely yuck. That said, so that can be done safely, is, water that's, so that can be done safely. And I don't know how I get over it, but
Can't get back to,
Go ahead, David.
No, I would say you can get it back to, I mean, you can treat that water probably to a cleaner state than the incoming fresh water than you're getting out of a river. That's how clean you get it done. And I recall, was it Bill Gates maybe who invested in one of these things, that I recall him, kind of having a drink of the water afterwards just to kind of show it's safe. But the technology we have today, we can get it probably cleaner than any water you'll find in a river or a dam anyway. Sorry, Will.
Yeah, no, look, toilet to tap or, showers to flowers. That's poor branding, in my opinion. Singapore got it right in that, they branded that water as new water and they bottle it and it looks, cool. So, yeah, I mean, think about how we use water right now. There's always somebody upstream and downstream. And, we take the water, we treat the water, and we drink the water, or we use it for other purposes. So, it's not unlike what happens in nature right now. We just don't, highlight it, I would say.
Yeah.
And there have been a few kind of adventurous companies that have done this. So I used to work in the brewing industry before PepsiCo, and I know there are a few of these craft brewers have done exactly that. They've kind of taken the kind of yuck factor and commercialized it, kind of playing on it and saying, almost presenting this as a niche product, and it's done fairly well. So there certainly is a market for it. It's just probably not anywhere near at that scale that it's will be readily adopted, put it that way.
And there's also that trust issue, frankly. The trust in the public institutions and corporations and financial institutions' trust has been kind of decimated over the decades. So that makes it even more important to be engaged with companies that you trust.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the state of infrastructure globally, I mean, it's appalling. And that would be a worrying factor in the sense that, how safe is that water that we're getting? But it shouldn't be something that stops us from doing it. It's certainly something that's a flag.
So let's. Sorry, go ahead, Will.
I would just add, in the U.S., apparently 60 million Americans do not trust their tap water. Now, that's a problem, and yeah, it's a problem.
There's good examples of why they might not. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also an opportunity for innovation. Again, it's so certainly what do the utilities have to do to change that perception, but. For the consumer, well, I suddenly have, a host of choices. I have, certainly bottled water, delivered water. I can treat water at home, whatever it may be. So innovation in hydration is a growing thing in the marketplace because of, perception around safety of water.
So let's talk about, let's go back to investing. So it is not that easy to invest in water, frankly, for most market participants. We think about infrastructure, we think about metering, we think about filtration, we think about measuring, but again, to invest directly, it's a little bit tricky. But Will, this is kind of what you do. So tell us how we invest in water. That is really interesting.
Yeah, so you can invest in funds. There are several out there, which is, candidly what I do. My investment advisor thinks I'm nuts because I invest in a category heavily. But I believe that the trends are compelling, and and this is not investment advice, by the way. This is just my personal view. Want to be clear about that. So yeah, certainly that's one option. You could look at an angel seed stage investing in innovative technology companies. There's a whole host of water technology hubs and accelerators, prize competitions that are out there that really create that pipeline, and that's the world that I live in. AB InBev just launched their fourth 100+ accelerator cohort, and I sat in on that this morning. And just a, really interesting collection of companies that are addressing, water issues, climate issues, energy, and so on. So, you can get involved in that world. Certainly you can invest in assets, that's certainly one opportunity. Related to assets, I would say that there's increased interest in the area of, water as a service, water treatment as a service. There are technology companies, I'd say, Series A growth stage companies that are very focused on that. And, for a company like Pepsi, they don't have to invest in there's no capital investment. They're paying for the treatment of a gallon of water, or gallons of water, whatever it may be. So, yeah, there are a number of different ways to come at it. I've made angel investments, like angel investments in tech companies, and learned a lot from that experience. And that was actually, the gateway for me to, raise capital for a fund.
And Will, you can, of course, invest indirectly in companies that are managing water very well. So you can buy PepsiCo stock.
Right. Exactly.
David, that was brilliant.
Really, in this context, none of us are giving investment advice. Will, I have to ask you, what are a couple of your favorite companies and funds? Because like I know of KBI, I know of Pictet is doing good work. What are a couple of your favorite funds or your single favorite company?
Why don't I give you a few companies? How's that? Now, full transparency, our first investment in the fund was in a company called Hydroloop, a Dutch gray water recycling company. So, the company takes water from your sink, for example, and treats it, uses it for other purposes, like flushing your toilet or watering your lawn. We like that because you can use water more than once. You're not getting safe drinking water and throwing it away. So reuse as a sector, Hydroloop for us made a lot of sense based on the fund size and focus. I do like solar desal. I think there's promise there. There's a company, another Dutch company, Desalinator. We haven't invested in them, but they're attractive in that they treat water at a local scale, using solar. So it addresses the energy side, addresses the carbon footprint side. They've got a pilot going on with Carlsberg, really interesting. There's a company, Aquacycle, out there. Really, really an interesting company, modular, digitally connected water treatment. And one of the things I love about them is that it's water treatment as a service. So, it sort of gets over the human part of it, the people part, the workforce part, and that company doesn't have to put capital up. They just have to, obviously understand that it treats water, and they pay for the value of the water, which is tied to treatment. There's a host of others I find really interesting that fit sort of my view of the world in terms of what has to change.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
It's quite an interesting point on the water technology, because I think one of the things that we battle with is, the type of capital equipment we buy has quite significant figures behind it, right? And your internal rate of return is often dismal, which basically it hampers us investing quite significantly as a result of it. Now, part of the reason for that is that water is practically free. As Will mentioned right in the beginning, you barely pay anything for it. And, when you start trying to factor that into your IRR calculations, it kind of goes out the window quite quickly. We starting to look at different ways to look at that. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at the full cost of oh, that was brilliant. We're looking at
I thought that was you, David, for a minute.
my ventriloquism. I do it as a side act. So one of the things that we're looking at is, for example, the full cost of water, where we factor in the energy costs and the chemical costs to treat water, and that helps us get a far truer value in water. The other interesting thing that we're starting to look at is a shadow price of water. So, how do we start pricing in externalities? But it is a constraint, absolutely, and something that we need to figure out. And this is where I think the role of innovation comes in terms of how do we drive down costs? How do we start value engineering some of these things to make it more attractive for companies like PepsiCo to implement? And you take it a step further to your smaller SMEs. There's no hope they're going to buy that sort of equipment because it's way outside of their affordability range. So that's a challenge.
So going to bringing that to the regulatory issues, we talked a little bit about the geopolitical issues, but what's going on from a regulatory standpoint? Well, we got there a little bit also with your comments, but in terms of what you're going to have to spend, David, what's in the hopper for the regulators? Nothing?
Not much at the moment. And yeah, it's one of the things that, and this is not a universal statement, so I just need to be clear on that. One of the things that we come up across every now and again is the fact that some of these regulations do not allow, for example, the recovery and reuse of water back into process, right? There's just a blanket ban. That's not even to say it's touching product. This is saying we'll take water and use it for cleaning somewhere else in the factory. There are a couple of countries that just prohibit that outright. And that sort of regulation is massively unhelpful. And it was probably said in a time when, I think we mentioned earlier in the conversation that, quality may not have been guaranteed back then. I think where we are today is completely different, right? And, it's a case of us constantly having to make the case that this is a safe thing to do. There is technology that allows us to do this. So, regulation can be an inhibitor for us in a couple of areas as well, which is not particularly helpful. But in terms of upcoming legislation, which we'll have to adapt to, apart from, there's a lot of regulation around your discharge, what you're doing with your discharge, how clean it is, where it's going, et cetera, et cetera. I think we may need to start thinking about, in particular areas like the West, whether you're going to start having, water restrictions coming in as the drought gets, increasingly worse and the water supply gets constrained even more. Those are the kind of things we start thinking about. Yeah. Sorry, Will, you're going to...
No, I was going to agree with you that
that's rare. Yep.
I know, but we're on a webinar. I thought I'd throw that out there, something different. But yeah, I mean, when people think about water regulations, it's typically treatment regulations, but now we're bumping into allocation as part of public policy and the regulatory framework. And I think that's going to be a challenge. You can treat water, it's going to come at a cost, but if you don't have the gallon, you don't have the gallon. So what does that mean for your business? And then it goes back to some of the innovation that David was talking about that they have built into their facility. So again, scarcity drives innovation.
All right. We have a little bit more time, and I'm just wondering, do we have any, Akshika, do we have any questions from the listeners?
Yes, we do. We have a few questions that have come in from the audience. And the first one that we'll start with is, given the water crisis, should we focus on water usage by corporates and their consumers and weight ESG scores relative to whether water is going into non-essential beverages and foods versus foods and beverages critical to nutrition and hydration?
I think that's a David question. No?
I'm probably not qualified to answer that question, to be honest. A personal view is that, a number of companies would have a very different exposure to water risk, right? It's not just necessarily they got a uniform exposure to water stress across the company. It's very rare that you'd have, like, PepsiCo. The vast majority of our operation areas, there's no water stress at all. So I would say it's a slightly difficult call to say that you would, necessarily look at a company in terms of what they're producing.
Yeah, I agree with David. I mean, what constitutes a non-essential beverage? I mean, look, consume goes back to humanity. People want choices, and companies are in the business of delivering those choices. So I think it goes back to, how does a company understand what is a risk? How do they manage the risk? And engage with stakeholders in the communities in which they operate in. So, for me, it's not black and white issue.
And we all have to be just thoughtful about where values come in and where creating value comes in. I personally think all water should go towards coffee. So that is a tricky question. It does and values.
The other thing as well is also, I mean, you really need to do your homework on those companies as well. For example, if you take a food being produced or a snack being produced in a water-stressed area, if you take our Mexico example, there's no freshwater footprint there at all. So it's really, I think and because water's so unique, so local, it's going to really depend on let's say how a individual company is responding to that water stress, what they're doing, what measures they've got in place, and how they're protecting that resource.
Yeah. Erika, what else you have?
Yes. So another question that came in was that solar desalination has already been mentioned. Are there any other specific technology solutions that could contribute to solving the water crisis in the future? And if so, what would they be?
I really like air moisture capture technology for, access to safe drinking water in places where people don't have access to safe drinking water, where right now they're fetching water, which, goes back to women and children. So, obviously the price of water is not comparable to what you can get from a, large centralized system, but in terms of innovative options that are out there, that's certainly one of them. And we have smart energy homes. We have dumb water homes, basically. So anything you can do in the home to use less, use it again, that reuse piece of the puzzle, I believe has great promise. And also localized treatment systems. Again, we have, costly centralized treatment systems. So, the ability to treat water, in an office building, in a condo, in a small neighborhood, things like that. And the Salesforce building in San Francisco is a good example of, hyper-local wastewater treatment technologies that have been adopted.
One of the things I'd throw in there is artificial intelligence. There's some amazing stuff that's coming out there, particularly in terms of how we reduce water loss within factories and how you use it more efficiently. So that's a great thing to keep an eye on as well.
So everyone, I know that some of us have a hard stop right now. I hope that this was helpful and constructive, and we are happy to follow up with anyone and everyone after this call. We will make the replay available. So thank you all, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.